Most villages made the wrong choice. Why did some settlements welcome spring with their entire population intact, while neighboring villages turned into ice tombs overnight? It was not a curse or an accident. It was a cold calculation and an engineering solution adopted long before the first snowfall. Most elders made a fatal mistake in trying to save heat, but instead of saving themselves, they built their own trap. People locked their doors, caulked the cracks, and thought they had defeated winter, unaware that their main enemy was already inside their homes. This enemy was invisible, odorless, and killed slowly while the inhabitants enjoyed the illusion of safety and comfort. The answer lies in the architecture of the medieval house, which could be both a fortress and a gas chamber. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn the true price expressed in sweat, suffocation, and lives of the simple desire to keep warm in a medieval hut.
We can't stay out here, please.
What if I told you that everything you believed about the cold was untrue, and that it wasn't the frost that killed people? The main danger of the medieval winter was a paradoxical thing: the desire to seal the home to preserve precious heat. Villagers tried to insulate their homes from the outside environment as much as possible, using moss, clay, and animal skins to seal even the smallest gaps. The logic was simple and understandable. The fewer gaps, the less firewood needed to sustain life, and the higher the chances of surviving the season. However, in the absence of chimneys, this strategy turned the house into a time bomb filled with combustion products. The smoke from the hearth, finding no way out, accumulated under the ceiling, creating a dense veil that descended lower and lower with each passing hour. People literally preserved themselves in a jar of carbon monoxide without even realizing that the air was becoming poisonous. This decision was made consciously because preparing firewood required enormous physical effort and time, which was always in short supply. Wood was a resource that not only had to be obtained, but also brought in, chopped and dried long before the snowfall began. Saving fuel seemed like a sensible step, allowing them to stretch their supplies until spring without unnecessary trips out into the cold. No one explained the chemistry of combustion to the peasants, so they relied solely on their feelings of warmth and comfort. Carbon monoxide acted insidiously, causing first slight fatigue, then drowsiness, from which many never returned. Entire families fell asleep in warm, well-caulked houses, never to wake up again. In those rare cases when someone survived, it was not because of good preparation, but because of poor construction. Cracks in the walls, a leaky roof, or a poorly fitted door provided the necessary flow of fresh air. The drafts that were so hated and fought against paradoxically became lifesavers. Cold air displaced carbon monoxide and forced smoke to rise higher, freeing up space to breathe. Those who were too lazy to plaster the walls with clay to perfection had a chance to see the dawn. History shows us that perfectionism in medieval construction often bordered on a death sentence. The choice between warmth and clean air was not obvious to people of that era who did not know the basics of ventilation. They were guided by an instinct that told them to hide from the wind, not let it into their homes. The hearth, located in the center of the room without a chimney, was called a smokehouse, and it dictated the rules of the game. The smoke had to escape through special smoke vents or through the structure of the thatched roof itself. If this path was blocked to preserve the temperature, the balance was instantly and irreversibly disrupted. It was a deadly trap that people built with their own hands, guided by the best of intentions. Interestingly, archaeologists find entire settlements where houses have been left untouched, with no signs of violence or struggle. This confirms the theory that death came quietly, in sleep, without causing panic. Things remained in their places, food supplies in the cellars were untouched, and the hearth had long since cooled. Neighbors might not even have noticed the tragedy until the snowdrifts began to melt. A mistake in ventilation calculations cost more than an enemy army raid or a crop failure. This is how natural selection took place, where it was not the strongest who survived, but those who knew how to breathe with the house. However, there were also those who understood the nature of things on an intuitive level and built differently. These craftsmen left special vents that could be adjusted depending on the direction of the wind. This required more firewood, but it guaranteed that people would still be alive in the house in the morning. Knowledge was passed down from father to son, often in the form of omens and superstitions that forbade locking the spirit of the house. It is difficult for modern people to imagine how one could voluntarily let the cold into the bedroom. But it was this icy stream that was the only guarantee of waking up. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about this paradoxical way of survival? Letting in the cold so as not to die from the heat? Write about it in the comments.
Pitch allows the heavy snow to slide away, preserving the thatch.
Are you ready to learn the truth about how the shape of a roof could save or destroy its inhabitants? The second critical choice was the design of the dwelling itself, or more precisely, the angle of the roof and the material used to build it. In regions with heavy snowfall, the roof had to withstand a tremendous load, measured in tons of snow. If the rafters were not strong enough or the angle was too shallow, the roof would simply collapse under the weight of the precipitation. This happened most often at the end of winter, when the snow became wet and heavy. People found themselves buried under the rubble of their own homes at their most vulnerable moment. The steep roof slopes characteristic of northern architecture were not a matter of aesthetics, but a strict necessity. They allowed the snow to slide off under its own weight, preventing critical accumulation. However, a roof that was too steep required more building material in a complex fastening system. This created high wind resistance, and strong winter winds could simply tear off the lightweight structure. The balance between the ability to shed snow and wind resistance was a delicate art. A mistake of a few degrees could cost the entire family their lives in the first storm. The roofing material was straw, reeds, or wooden shingles laid in several layers. A thatched roof had excellent thermal insulation properties, keeping the heat inside the house. But it also required constant care and renewal, as it rotted and decayed from moisture. In winter, when access to new materials was impossible, any leak became a disaster. Water getting inside the insulation froze, tearing the structure of the roof and depriving it of its protective properties. Inside the house, the space was organized to make the most efficient use of heat from the only source of fire. Sleeping places were located above floor level, on lofts where warm air rose. It was cold downstairs and smoky upstairs, so people had to find a happy medium. Food and equipment storage areas were located along the cold walls, creating an additional buffer. This zoning was not a whim, but the only way to exist in a confined space. Particular attention was paid to the entrance, which was often a low and narrow passage. The door was made small with a high threshold to minimize heat loss when entering and exiting. Such a passage forced people to bow, but it reliably blocked the cold air from the street. In wealthy homes, a cold vestibule was built to serve as a gateway between the street and the living area. The poor often hung thick skins or felt to create a multi-layered curtain. Windows in such houses were the exception rather than the rule, and were tiny openings. They were covered with ox bladders or oiled cloth, which let in dim light but kept out the wind. It was impossible to see anything through such windows. They served only as an indicator of the change from day to night. Heat loss through window openings was considered an unacceptable luxury for the average peasant. Life took place in semi-darkness, which also left its mark on everyday life and psychology. The foundation, or rather its absence in the modern sense, also played a role in thermoregulation. Houses were often dug into the ground, creating semi-dugouts that used the geothermal heat of the soil. The ground froze more slowly than the air, and the floor in such a dwelling remained relatively warm. The walls were reinforced with soil, creating a powerful embankment that protected the lower crowns from freezing. This earth cocoon was the most reliable protection against the winds. The choice of location for construction was determined not by the beauty of the landscape, but by protection from prevailing winds. Villages huddled against hillsides or forest edges, using the terrain as a natural shield. A solitary house in an open space was doomed to freeze. The collective arrangement of houses also helped to break up wind currents. Streets were planned to be narrow and winding, so that the wind could not pick up speed between buildings. This complex system only worked with constant maintenance and attention to detail. A lazy owner who didn't fix the roof in the fall would find himself in an icy tomb by midwinter. Survival architecture didn't forgive mistakes and required constant work. Obtaining water in winter became hard daily labor that took away the last of their strength. Frozen rivers and lakes required constant cutting of holes, which were covered with ice within a few hours. The ice was thick and hard, and chipping away at it with primitive tools was an exhausting task. Water was carried in buckets on a yoke, trying not to spill a drop, as wet clothes froze instantly. The path from the river to the house along a slippery slope could be fatal with one wrong move. Melting snow seemed like an easier solution, but it was deceptively easy. Snow has a low density, and to get a pot of water, it was necessary to melt a huge mountain of snow. This led to a colossal overspending of firewood, which had to be saved for heating. In addition, the meltwater had an unpleasant taste and did little to quench thirst due to the lack of salts. People resorted to this method only in extreme cases or during snowstorms. The wells required special care. They had to be insulated and covered with lids. If the water in the well froze, it could leave half the village without drinking water. Ice mountains formed around the wells from spilled water, turning the approach to them into a dangerous attraction. Falling into a well in winter meant certain death from hypothermia and injury. Washing clothes in winter was practically impossible and was reduced to freezing out parasites. Laundry was taken out into the frost, where lice and bed bugs died from the low temperatures. Clothes were not washed with water in order not to spread dampness in the house and waste resources. Hygiene took a back seat to preserving body heat. For technical needs, they used gray water left over from cooking or washing. It was used to water livestock or to mix clay for minor repairs. Not a single drop of moisture was to be wasted in this closed cycle. Water conservation was as strict as food conservation. Ice was also used as a building material in a natural refrigerator. Ice blocks were cut from the river and used to line cellars to keep them cool in the spring. Sometimes ice was used to make temporary windbreaks around the house. It was a free and accessible resource that had to be used wisely. Animals also needed water, and watering them was a separate concern. Holes for livestock were made wide and shallow, but care was taken to ensure that the animals did not fall through. Snow was often given to animals instead of water, but this lowered their body temperature and required more feed. A balance between thirst and heat conservation was sought every day. Snowdrifts could completely cut off a house from its water source for several days. In such cases, people were forced to use the supplies stored in the house. Clay jugs and wooden tubs of water were kept in the coolest corner. The water in them often froze, and the ice had to be broken up. The lack of clean water led to digestive problems and exacerbated chronic diseases. People drank herbal decoctions and hot broths to compensate for the shortage in some way. Hot drinks were a way to warm up and get at least some vitamins. The very nature of water, changing its states, dictated the rhythm of life in the settlement. Ice formation and ice breakup were the main calendar events, cutting off or opening up roots. People were completely dependent on the aggregate state of H2O. Want to know a secret that will change your perception of personal space? The most effective way to keep warm at night was a living radiator consisting of the bodies of all the inhabitants of the house. The concept of privacy and personal space completely disappeared in winter for the sake of survival. People slept huddled together, forming a single mass of warmth under shared skins and blankets. This collective warmth allowed them to survive the nights when the temperature in the house dropped to critical levels. The warmest places in the center were reserved for the most vulnerable members of the group. Adult men and women lay down at the edges, creating a living barrier against the cold air. Heat exchange within such a group was so effective that the temperature in the center of the pile could be 10 degrees higher than in the room. It was an ancient, instinctive tactic copied from animals that huddled together in packs. Clothes were not removed at night. Only belts were loosened and laces untied. The multiple layers of clothing created air pockets that retained body heat. Outer clothing, sheepskin coats, and fur coats were used as extra blankets, covering the group from above. The weight of such a bed was considerable, but the heaviness gave a feeling of security. The fabrics used for sleeping were coarse, woolen, or homespun linen. Wool kept you warm even when wet, which was super important in condensation conditions. Linen was used for undergarments, absorbing sweat and skin oils. bedding wasn't washed in winter, it was just shaken out and aired in the cold. During the most severe frosts, small livestock such as sheep or goats could be brought into the living area of the house. The animals provided additional powerful heat and increased the humidity. The smell in the room became heavy, but it was the smell of life and warmth. Living alongside animals was the norm, not the exception, in peasant life. The psychological aspect of sleeping together was also important. The feeling of closeness was reassuring. In the darkness and cold, touching another person gave you hope that you were not alone. The fear of freezing in your sleep receded when you could hear the breathing of your loved ones nearby. This united the family on a physiological level. Getting up in the morning was the most difficult moment, when you had to leave the warm cocoon. It took willpower to crawl out from under the skins into the hut, which had cooled down overnight. The first to get up was the one whose turn it was to heat the stove and prepare hot food. The rest waited until the air warmed up a little. Daytime sleep was also practiced to save energy and reduce waking hours. On cloudy days when there was no work to be done, people could spend most of the day in a state of semi-sleep. This state was called winter hibernation and helped them survive the lean times. Could you give up your room for the sake of survival? In the next chapter, you will learn how the ground beneath your feet became the walls of your home. The construction technology used by our ancestors was ingenious in its simplicity. Semi-dugouts and sunken dwellings used the thermal inertia of the planet itself. At a depth of 1.5 meters, the soil temperature remained stable and positive even during the most severe and prolonged frosts. By digging the floor of the house into the ground, builders obtained a free and eternal source of heat directly from below. This allowed them to save a huge amount of firewood, which was worth its weight in gold in winter. The walls protruding above the ground were usually made of thick pine or oak logs. All the gaps between them were carefully filled with dry forest moss to eliminate even the slightest drafts. Wood itself is an excellent heat insulator, but its natural thickness was often insufficient to protect against icy winds. Therefore, the walls were additionally covered with a thick layer of earth or turf almost up to the roof. The result was a gentle hill with a door and a sloping roof, which the winter wind simply flowed around. Inside such an earthen house, the humidity was always quite high, but the temperature fluctuated very little. This saved the inhabitants from the sharp temperature changes that were characteristic of completely above-ground buildings. The dense earthen walls had the unique ability to breathe, absorbing excess moisture and releasing it back into the air when it dried out. This natural climate control worked for centuries without the slightest glitch or breakdown. Thanks to this, it was always easier to breathe in the dwelling, even when a blizzard was raging outside. The floors in such houses often remained earthen, but they were tamped down with heavy mallets and covered with clay until they were as hard as stone. The clay floor was additionally lubricated with animal fat or linseed oil to prevent dusting and reduce water absorption. Fresh straw, dry grass, or reeds were spread thickly on the floor and replaced as they became dirty. This soft layer of straw served as excellent additional insulation, separating people's feet from the cold, deep ground. Thus, even in the most severe cold, the floor inside the house remained relatively livable. Typical semi-dugouts had virtually no windows, or they were located at ground level. Light entered only through the open front door or a special smoke vent in the roof ridge. Life in such a house was indeed very similar to life in a burrow, but it was a very warm and safe burrow. In those harsh times, protection from the cold was much more important than any need for bright sunlight. People were willing to put up with eternal twilight for the chance to simply live to see spring. The entrance to the dwelling was most often arranged through a long and narrow corridor vestibule, which was also slightly recessed into the ground. This corridor effectively dampened sudden gusts of wind and created the necessary air buffer between the street and the room. The same place was used to store household tools, firewood, and heavy outerwear, leaving all the street dirt outside the living area. This well-thought-out layout vaguely resembled the entrance to a labyrinth, which invariably led the traveler to warmth and the hearth. It was the first obstacle in the way of the frost trying to get into the house. Building a good semi-dugout required significantly less scarce wood, which was extremely important in steppe and sparsely forested areas. The main building materials here were the hard labor of diggers and the free natural soil underfoot. This made housing as accessible as possible even for the poorest and most disadvantaged segments of the population. However, poverty in this case did not mean poor quality construction. Often, such dugout houses were much warmer and cozier than the rich above-ground log houses, which were exposed to the winds. The serious problem of waterproofing in such conditions was solved with the help of birch bark sheets and layers of well-fired clay. Underground groundwater could easily flood the dwelling, so the site for construction was always chosen on high ground. Deep drainage ditches were dug around the house to divert rainwater and meltwater away from the walls. The builders knew that a damp dugout would quickly become a tomb for its inhabitants, while a dry one would turn into a real fortress. Protection from moisture was the owner's main concern throughout the year. The roof of the semi-dugout was also tightly covered with layers of turf, which grew thick with grass over the summer. The house literally blended into the surrounding landscape, becoming almost invisible to forest animals, enemies, and cold winds. Over time, the strong roots of the grass firmly bound the soil, creating a durable and completely waterproof living carpet. Nature itself gradually completed and strengthened what man had once begun to build. In summer, such a roof provided protection from the heat, and in winter it retained precious warmth inside. Every spring, such houses required mandatory drying and minor repairs to the outer embankment. The earth inevitably settled over the winter, and it had to be replenished, strengthening the slopes with fresh turf. It was an endless annual cycle of close interaction between man and the soil that gave him both shelter and food. People of that era never fought against the earth, but tried to live in harmony with it. But the warmth of the earth was only half the battle, because inside the house it was still dim. Winter days in northern latitudes are very short, and most of our ancestors' lives were spent in deep twilight or complete darkness. Quality lighting for homes in those days was an incredibly expensive and inaccessible luxury. Candles made of pure beeswax were only available to the wealthy church and the upper nobility. Ordinary working people were forced to use other, more primitive and cheaper means. For centuries, the main source of light in a peasant's hut was a splinter. A torch was a thin, long splinter of dry wood, which had to be selected and split correctly. Birch or pine was usually used for this, making sure that the wood burned evenly and did not produce acrid soot. The torch was inserted into a special forged holder called a svetets. A wide wooden trough filled with water was always placed under the svetets. Burning embers fell directly into the water, which prevented accidental fires, a constant threat to wooden houses. A single thin splint burned out in just a few minutes, so it had to be constantly replaced with a new one. Small children in the family were often entrusted with this monotonous work, watching the svetets and adding new splints in time. The light from the splint was flickering and very dim, barely illuminating the small space around it. The rest of the house remained plunged into thick shadows. This required people to be especially careful with every movement inside the cramped room. A more expensive and prestigious option was tallow candles, which the people called makani. They were made from melted animal fat, dipping the wick repeatedly into the hot mass. These candles smoked terribly and gave off a sharp, unpleasant smell of burnt fat, but they burned much longer than torches. The wick in such candles had to be constantly adjusted with special tongs to remove the soot. The light from them remained dim and yellow, creating bizarre dancing shadows on the walls. To maintain a constant light in the room, simple oil lamps in the form of bowls with fat and a wick were also used. They provided the bare minimum of lighting, but allowed people to at least somehow orient themselves in space without bumping into furniture. Any fat that was unfit for human consumption or the lowest quality vegetable oil served as fuel for such lamps. These lamps could burn for hours without requiring the close attention of their owners. They were a kind of nightlight in those harsh times. The constant darkness dictated its own strict rules for all evening activities of family members. During the long evenings, women usually spun yarn or knitted warm clothes almost by touch, from memory. Men and craftsmen did only work that did not require too sharp eyesight. This could be weaving baskets from willow twigs or repairing simple harnesses. Reading books or doing delicate artistic embroidery was practically impossible in such dim and unstable light. In such conditions, people developed incredible sensitivity in their fingers and true night vision. Every household economized on light to the extreme. Lighting a torch for no good reason was considered the height of wastefulness and stupidity. Fire was used only to perform specific and necessary tasks. The rest of the free time, the family sat in complete darkness by the dying hearth, saving their meager resources. During these long, dark hours, quiet conversations, fairy tales, and old songs completely replaced any visual entertainment. Paradoxically, darkness brought people together, forcing them to communicate more with each other and share news. The effect of constant twilight on the human psyche was very oppressive and difficult. Chronic light deprivation caused many people to suffer from seasonal depression, apathy, and constant lethargy. People waited for the first spring sun as a great salvation not only from the cold, but also from this endless darkness. The winter solstice holidays have always been the most important holidays for the people, marking the return of life and light. In winter, the windows in houses were often completely covered with thick shutters or completely blocked with snow to preserve heat. Daylight penetrated the interior of the dwelling for only a few short hours through a slightly open door. An ordinary dwelling was transformed into a dark, closed chamber, completely cut off from the vast outside world. It was a life in a confined space where every ray of sunshine was worth its weight in gold. In wealthier homes, the owners could afford to use mica window shutters, which let in a little more light. But even these windows were cloudy and consisted of many small pieces held together by lead or wooden frames. Real transparent glass was unimaginably rare in those days and cost a fortune. An ordinary person could live their entire life without ever seeing their reflection in a clear window pane. The world of a medieval person in winter inevitably narrowed to a single small spot of light from a burning torch. Everything outside this tiny circle belonged to the frightening darkness and icy cold. The struggle for a glimmer of light was an important part of our ancestors' struggle for survival and preservation of their human form. Now that we know how people fought against the cold and darkness, it's time to look at their plates and discover the secret of their winter diet. The arrival of spring did not always mean salvation. Often it brought new deadly dangers. The melting snow turned roads and courtyards into an impassable, muddy mess. Humidity in homes rose to critical levels, and walls began to weep. Food supplies, if there were any left, began to spoil and rot quickly. Organisms depleted over the winter were vulnerable to any infection and colds. It was in the spring that mortality from lung diseases and fevers peaked. Immunity was at zero. There were no vitamins, and dampness finished off the week. Spring plague was a common occurrence in village chronicles. The thawing of rivers and floods could cut off a settlement from the world or flood it. Icy water flooded cellars, destroying seed grain and the last supplies. Fighting the flood required enormous physical strength, which people no longer had. Taking the cattle out to their first pasture was a tearful celebration. The animals were thin and weak, and many did not survive the winter in the barn. Restoring the herd took months and years of hard work. The loss of a cow, the family's breadwinner, was a tragedy for the family. Cleaning the yards and houses of the rubbish and manure that had accumulated over the winter was a titanic task. The unsanitary conditions, hidden by snow, came to light with all their smells and dangers. It was necessary to clean up urgently to prevent epidemics. The first greens, nettles, and pigweed became a life-saving addition to the meager diet. People gathered any edible herbs to stave off hunger until the first harvest. Spring green soup was a symbol of hope and survival. Psychological relief was mixed with anxiety about the future harvest. A new cycle of hard fieldwork began on the still cold ground. There was no time to rest. It was necessary to plow and sow. Repairs to houses damaged by snow and moisture began immediately. Roofs were recovered, walls were recaulked, and stoves were rebuilt. Preparations for the next winter began on the very first day of spring. Those who survived this cycle became stronger and more experienced. Natural selection left the most resilient and prudent. The village came to life, filled with sounds and movement. Winter receded, but left its scars on people's faces and in their memories. It was an annual war in which there were no winners, only survivors. And everyone knew that in 6 months, the enemy would return. We saw that survival was a complex set of architectural, economic, and psychological decisions. One mistake in ventilation, an incorrect roof angle, or eaten seed grain could destroy everyone. It was not just a struggle against the cold, but an intellectual duel with nature, where life was at stake. People built not just houses, but complex life support systems operating at the limits of their capabilities. Their experience, paid for with thousands of lives, formed the basis of modern architecture and our understanding of comfort. What topics would you like to see in the next videos? Perhaps an exploration of the medicine of that time, or survival cooking? Write your suggestions in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new historical investigations.